So it's my distinct pleasure to come back to sort of an old home. I grew up outside of Manchester and my family spent 3 years there when I was growing up, so it's always wonderful to come back here. And thank you, Stephen, for seeing you. Stephen and I go back a long time. It's been many years now since we first met each other.
If you don't mind me saying so, Ed, you deserve the big auditorium as well, not this small room.
So clearly, surgical ventricular reconstruction, SVR, it's a procedure that's evolved over 20 years, gone through a lot of different iterations from the Batista operation to the door operation. But the bottom line is, can we reconstruct the ventricle? Can we take a globular structure, round, with very, very small function, try to recreate it into an elliptical, more efficient model, and somehow have an impact on this issue related to ventricular remodeling? And you know, the hope is that if we change this, would we be able to improve survival? And the STICH trial was designed, and I was one of the original people with some of the group that said, can we define the role of this? So we all went off to, I remember going off to Monaco and sitting up on the thing looking at the harbor with Vincent Dorr in the most unbelievable setting I'd ever seen in my life, and learned how to do the door procedure. And we brought it back to the United States, and there was some variability. And around the same time, Jerry Buckberg, working with an anatomist in Spain, came up with the helical structure and the way that the fibers emerged and the way it changed, made the ventricle efficient. And so we thought if we could make it back into elliptical, and based on the studies of Menacani and the other people in Dorr, really dealing to a great degree with post-infarction, either severely akinetic or dyskinetic, where if you reduce that inefficiency of squeezing, particularly into an aneurysm, you can improve overall survival. So this study emerged, and hypothesis 2 of this was, does the addition of surgical ventricular reconstruction to CABG, similar to what the issue is with mitral valve, add value? And clearly, after a number size, it was a double-blinded trial. It was in 127 sites, 26 countries. They had to have coronary disease amenable to bypass grafting and an ejection fraction less than 35%. And people got randomized, pretty much the usual kind of flow pattern, but it ended up being you had to be eligible for SVR and meet the inclusion criteria. But particularly in many centers over this time, there was an evolution because medical management, certainly with beta blockers and all the things you've heard about this morning, it was changing the remodeling therapy philosophy because people would be seen earlier, door-to-balloon time was shortening, and we weren't seeing the big infarcts. So there was difficulty with entrance and getting people into this trial. And what happened is, when the people were eligible, there were about 1,000 people that were eligible for hypothesis 2 that could be randomized into coronary surgery versus coronary surgery plus surgical ventricular restoration as trained by Vincent Dorr. And the issue there then was, when you looked at it, there were 292 versus 280 that ultimately got randomized, and there was pretty propensity-based matching. But there was definitely variability among the surgical expertise and the kinds of patients within this, and this ultimately got criticized. But the bottom line outcome was, from death from any cause in this series, 292 versus 289, the results were identical. There was no significant benefit from ventricular restoration. There was a little change in what happened early versus what happened late, but over time there was no change. And that's what the debate became. Because when you looked at it in a survival curve, there was no shifting to the left with SVR, and the survival curves looked essentially identical. So was that the final word? Well, Andy Wexler and Jerry Buckberg and a few of the other people who were actually originally part of the design said, well, wait a minute. Not a great study, and it doesn't really meet the standards, and it doesn't meet the historical perspectives of the things that had been written by particularly Vincent Dorr and Lorenzo Manicani. So they kind of got a renegade group together, and they said, okay, let's look at a registry, and let's see if we can redefine the enrollment. So they looked at the Restore registry, and they said, here it is. We'll look at 1,100 people. Now this is, once again, all retrospective, no prospective randomized trial. They tried to break down the groups that had differences in the size of the ventricular end systolic index. They needed an akinetic segment, and almost all of them got coronary surgery plus SVR. And then they looked at it retrospectively. And their outcomes was fair. They had an operative mortality of about 5%. 10% required some kind of ventricular assist. And the usual group of them got mitral valve repair. And the problem is that even when they looked at it, and they tried to break it down with the size, so if it was a bigger ventricle, obviously they didn't do as well, and ventricular systolic index of 120, but that wasn't really anything new. That was something that we knew beforehand. If the heart was dead, it was going to stay dead, and if there was heart had some muscle capacity. And that's the issue with us as surgeons. If we don't figure out a way that really changing the entire conformation in a more functional manner is going to improve survival, we're going to recreate the data. And once again, when they looked at New York Heart Association, another parameter, it was the same. The also issue is that at the conclusion, their 5-year data is that their overall survival was 68%. And when you then tried to look at it and compare it to the STICH data, it almost wasn't as good as the STICH data in the randomized prospective trial in the CABG alone group. So even though it was maybe a subgroups within it could benefit, nobody identified who that was. And when you then looked at some of it, the only groups that seemed to be making any difference when you retrospectively was actually the ventricles that were smaller. So if you caught it early, you might make a difference. That was the only one that showed the shift of benefit for CABG with SVR to the left. And this is the same type of thing. Only in left ventricular end systolic volume indexes that were small could you actually shift the hazard ratio to the left. So when you looked at this subgroup analysis, the only benefit were in really small ventricles, and still a question of whether or not it made a difference. Well, Michler, who was one of the original people from New York, went back and started to look at it again. And once again, when he looked at CABG versus SVR, blew in CABG alone, and the propensity that died, maybe late there was a little bit of difference, but this was the problem when you investigated it out here, there was no differences. However, when you looked at the overall hazard ratio, there did seem to be some crossing based on the post-operative, what you ended up with. If you ended up truly with a smaller ventricle, then when you looked at CABG and you had the smaller ventricle, maybe there was some survival benefit. So their conclusion is that when you looked at it, if you looked at the post-operative left ventricular end systolic volume index, and if it was greater than 60, the percent that died was way up, and the percent that stayed alive was better if you had SVR. So maybe there was a subgroup, and this is the same thing when you look at it based on how much of a reduction have you got. If you got greater than a 30% reduction, also maybe there was some benefit. So black is where it's greater versus less. So that's why there's a little bit of a controversy still. Is there a group of patients seen earlier where you do a really good reduction and you actually do change it? Will there be any survival benefit at all over the long term? And we don't know that. That remains concerning. And once again, when you go ahead and look at it, one of the criticisms of this STICH was that the percent reduction in volume was smaller than some of the original European studies. But remember, so many of these studies, you were talking about a dyskinetic. So when you started measuring volumes, you were going to see a greater protection because a lot of that was dyskinetic. So the question still remains, in an akinetic, already medically remodeled ventricle, because our cardiologists are doing that primarily, will this have benefit from us as a surgeon? It makes sense that the ventricular modeling is the key component. So a lot of us still believe that in certain patients, if you can remodel it, then the combination with mitral valve surgery, that might make a difference in the long run. But in the short run, we are going to lose this discussion because the fundamental problem is the muscle's dead. And until we really figure out how that works. So, the chase here is that patients that did benefit had smaller preoperative volumes and a bigger percentage of reduction. And that may be very, very important. But now figuring out who's going to benefit remains unclear. And we're in a very vulnerable position to our medical therapists who give medicines and remodel. And of course, because of this, there's extensive controversy. Does it matter? I don't know. If you look at the Heart Failure Review and you look at all of these episodes from 1980 to 2010, which have been publishing the mortality for SVR, it hasn't changed. It's not like we're making some huge beneficial contributions, how we've improved technique. We haven't changed it. It's not being, maybe in a few centers. One of the things, my theme over the next few days is to say, you do in Europe have a benefit because you centralize your system. In the United States, where we have a decentralized system, the ability to get any kind of surgical experience to really address this doesn't exist. The United States becomes a statistical validation center because of its historical databases. But otherwise, we're not going to solve this problem in the United States at all. And of course, if you look at the 5-year survival, same thing. With all of this SVR, we really haven't, none of these studies have really shown a huge benefit. So we haven't seen any real trend since 1980 until 2010. So one conclusion to our cardiology colleagues, when they look at this without a survival benefit and an upfront risk as surgeons, they go, irrespective of the criticism, the results of this only prospective randomized trial is that this is the end of SVR as we know it. Now, I would take exception to that scientifically. And I think there are subsets that will make a difference. I think that it's important for surgeons to know how to do this. It comes into play with aneurysms. It comes into play in people with MR, where you may be able to improve the MR just by the SVR, or in people who have VSDs, where we reconstruct the inside of the ventricle in a similar fashion. So I think that it's important technique to know. I'm fearful we'll completely abandon it. But what's the real option? Well, this is exactly what the option is in the United States. Put an LVAD in. Look at the change. Look at the change. This is the Intermex registry of what's happened since we have non-pulsatile flow. This is the expensive solution. We keep managing them medically until they flail. We can't stand taking care of them anymore. Ship them off for an LVAD. So in my institution, over the last few years, we've gone from 30 LVADs, and we're going to be putting in 60 LVADs this year. Because transplant doesn't make a difference. It's still limited by the donor pool. That donor pool, in fact, shrinks. So now you're going to hear this discussion all this weekend about, destination therapy. This is the new standard for the management of heart failure. But because it's easy, that presents all sorts of new problems for us. But at least this is the solution that most people are coming to, and we have to figure this out. So clearly, with anterior LV aneurysms, dyskinetic, or really severe akinetic, it may have a role. it's going to have a role. The reason the ventricle did better with the smaller ones is probably because the rest of the muscle was working. If the rest of the muscle stops working and the volumes go up, it's not going to make a difference. We're too late. Same thing with MR. When the ventricle gets too big, you're not going to make a survival. It's the muscle that limits their long-term problem. And you can reduce the annulus like Bowling did, but the study you didn't show was that 3 years later, his own colleagues said, it all comes back, and they all do the same. Selectively. That's the problem we face. So part of our education is that we've got to get at it early. We may have some role in ischemic, but we've got to be the driver if we're going to try to solve this problem. At least we just can't abandon it as surgeons. We've got to figure out, if you reposition a muscle, if you combine them in some way, if you take the right subset, if you can argue that you can do it earlier when the rest of the muscle still works, that may make a difference. But it's a scientific, intellectual, political challenge that we have as surgeons to make a contribution to this literature. Because I can tell you, the interventional cardiologists are not. All they care about, they see dollar signs because of the statistics that you show. Prognosis is, it's like atrial fib. Prognosis is terrible, so everybody who has MR, so what are we going to do? We're going to go in and address some little component of it. And they're going to be doomed to the same failure that we have, only they're going to make a lot of money in the meantime doing it. So we have a challenge to make a contribution to this scientifically. Thank you very much.